Hi everyone, my name is Irving, and this presentation focuses on the relationship between race and the criminal justice system through photoanalysis. The purpose of this project is to show how everyday environments, not just people, can reflect deeper patterns of inequality. Each image I took represents a different stage of how race intersects with crime, policing, and our justice system. As discussed in our course, race is not just an individual identity, but a social structure that shapes access to opportunity within institutions and overall life outcomes. Starting with my first slide, this image shows a physical barrier, which represents segregation in unequal spaces. I chose this photo because barriers like fences or gated areas are a visual representation of separation. Now, even though legal segregation has ended, spatial inequality still exists in a more subtle but powerful way. As we learned in class, structural inequality shapes where people live, which directly affects access to education, safety, and economic opportunities. This matters for the criminal justice system because communities with fewer resources are often more heavily policed and more likely to experience crime-related issues, and not because race itself, but because of unequal conditions. Okay, now moving on to my next talking point, I have here over-policing and surveillance. This kind of ties back into some of the things that I talked about in my race reflection paper that we did a couple of weeks ago. The image shows surveillance or police presence that represents over-policing. I took this photo because surveillance devices and police visibility are not evenly distributed across all communities. For example, in many communities of color, there is increased monitoring and law enforcement presence. This connects quite well to that race reflection paper and an idea that I had of how race influences interactions with the justice system beyond actual behavior. Over-policing increases the likelihood of contact with law enforcement, even for minor infractions, which contributes to disparities in arrests and charges. This reflects what researchers describe as a feedback loop, where increased surveillance leads to more arrests, reinforcing the perception that certain communities are more criminal, even when they're not. The next image I took ties into criminalization of space. Now this sign, or this image shows a sign like no loitering or no trespassing. However, it's just a reserved parking sign. I'm sure that if you park there, you get towed. However, I kind of just want to tie this into something like a no loitering or no trespassing. I chose this because it represents how space itself can be criminalized. These rules may seem neutral, but in reality, they are often enforced differently depending on who is present. For some individuals, simply being in a space could lead to suspension, towing, police contact, etc. This connects to the idea of implicit bias, which I also discussed in my race reflection paper, where unconscious stereotypes influence how people are perceived and treated, even when behavior is the same amongst all race. Certain groups may be seen as more threatening or suspicious, leading to unequal enforcement of the rules, which we have seen through media and news, and sometimes in real life. And for my next image, this also ties into pathways to the system. This image represents pathways into the criminal justice system. It may look just like the Arizona State University map, but I chose this location because it is a school. It could be like a street or a public space because it shows how environment shapes outcomes over time. In my paper, I also discussed how structural inequality creates conditions that increase system involvement, and that is a key point that I kind of wanted to touch on during this presentation. because this includes underfunded schools, lack of resources, and limited opportunities. This is often referred to the school to prison pipeline, where early disadvantages increase the likelihood of future contact with the criminal justice system. These pathways show that crime is not about individual choice, but about long-term structural conditions. For my next slide, I took 2 images rather than 1. This ties into economic equality. As you see on the top versus the bottom, you have greenery that on the top that doesn't seem like it is equal to the one on the bottom. Maybe it hasn't gotten any water, maybe it was sprayed with chemicals. However, I think this ties in perfectly because it shows it reflects economic disparity, such as a rundown area or lack of investment. I took this photo to highlight how race and class are deeply connected. As I explained in my paper, communities with fewer economic resources are often more exposed to crime and also more heavily policed. This creates a cycle where inequality leads to an increased system of involvement, and the system of involvement reinforces inequality. This aligns with the concept of structural violence, where harm is produced by social systems over time, even without direct physical force. For my next point, I want to tie in the criminal justice system itself. This image represents institutions like courts or detention centers, and I chose this image because it represents where the decisions are made that are going to have those long-term consequences. I want to also discuss how sentencing is one of the clearest examples of racial inequality. For example, there is research that shows that people of color often receive longer sentences than white individuals for similar offenses, even when controlling for legal factors. This also shows that inequality is not just about policing, but about how cases are handled within the system itself. For my next slide, I have confinement and control. It was a little bit harder to find what I was looking for in an image, such as the barbed wire fences, but one day I was passing one and I decided to take it because I thought it would be perfect for this slide in particular. The image that I have shows physical barriers like fences, bars, or restricted spaces once again, but I chose the barbed wire fence because these barriers represent more than just physical restriction. They represent the broader system of mass incarceration, which disproportionately has impacted communities of color. As Michelle Alexander argues, mass incarceration functions as a system of social control that continues patterns of racial inequality in modern form. This connects back to how policies and enforcement practices have long-term consequences beyond the individual. Then we have the community impact of it all. This image represents the impact on communities such as empty spaces or a feeling of absence. I chose this photo because incarceration does not just affect individuals, it affects entire communities. In my paper, prior to this, I discussed how incarceration leads to family disruption, economic hardship, and long-term instability. When large numbers of people are removed from a community, it weakens social structures and limits opportunities for future generations. This shows that how the effects of the criminal justice system extend far beyond the courtroom, but in our everyday society. Overall, my photoanalysis shows how race, space, and the criminal justice system are deeply intertwined with one another. Each image represents a different stage, from structural inequality to policing, sentencing, to long-term community impact. What this project demonstrates is that inequality is not always obvious, but it is built so deeply into our systems, environments, and everyday experiences. As we've learned in this course, understanding these patterns is essential in recognizing how the system operates in practice, not just in theory. Addressing these disparities require both institutional reform and broader changes to the social conditions that produce the inequality. Thank you for watching this. I can't wait to watch everyone else's as well.